This edition of Monocle on Saturday was first broadcast on the 13th of July 2024. Hello, I'm Georgina Godwin, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. This is Monocle on Saturday. Coming up on today's programme, we'll have a look through the week's news and culture with political analyst and author of the upcoming book Zero Sum, Charles Hecker. Then we're joined by Neil Griffiths to talk about founding the independent publisher Weatherglass Books and the Republic of Consciousness Prize for Small Presses. That's all ahead here on Monocle on Saturday. First though, here's the news. Israeli forces pulled back from parts of Gaza City overnight after a fierce week-long offensive that met with Hamas resistance, leaving dozens of dead and wrecking homes and roads. The offensive, 10 months into Israel's campaign to eliminate Hamas militants, took place as US-backed mediators sought to finalise a peace deal that would free remaining hostages. Russia has accused Australia of inciting anti-Russian paranoia for charging a Russian-born couple with espionage, prompting Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to tell Moscow to back off. Albanese said today Russia needs to stop interfering in the domestic affairs of other sovereign nations. And more than 100 countries are expected to back a global alliance against hunger that Brazil has proposed. The official launch of the so-called Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty is planned for the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro in November, but all issues regarding the agreement text have been fully resolved, paving the way for several countries to announce their endorsement as early as July at a G20 meeting in the Brazilian city. And that's your Monocle Radio News. Hello, and welcome to Monocle on Saturday. Welcome to Charles Hecker. Good morning.
Good morning, Georgina.
How are you doing?
I'm doing okay, feeling reasonably perky for a Saturday morning.
Now, you're American.
You might have guessed.
What on earth is going on?
Oh, Georgina. So we're going to start our review of the papers and the news with an article in the New York Times. And frankly, it's just one of many articles coming out of the press in the United States lately about Joe Biden and the absolutely torrid week that he's had trying to maintain his viability as a presidential candidate. And the news is coming fairly hot and fast, challenging him. And before we jump into the actual coverage, I should say that there's already been a tiny bit of slippage in his position, because you recall that over the past week he said, only the good Lord himself would talk me out of running for the presidency. And his more recent sort of line is slightly less ecclesiastical, where he said, if my advisors tell me that I have no chance of winning, then I will withdraw. And while that statement is slightly more earthbound, it also has a bit of a sting in the tail, because to determine conclusively at this time whether or not you're going to win the election is extremely difficult. And so he's made it gray and vague enough to keep his candidacy viable. But basically, the very bold, fat, leading headline from the New York Times is that Biden holds firm as worried Democrats take their case directly to him. And so here comes this group of advisors, essentially, telling him like it is. And what we also learn from this story and from other coverage in the Times and elsewhere is that about $90 million worth of campaign funding is now on hold until he makes up his mind about what he's going to do. This comes hot on the heels of George Clooney, the actor, saying that he can no longer support President Biden. And before we all get angry about, well, here's Hollywood sort of throwing its weight around, George Clooney is a celebrity, but at the same time, we're reminded that he is a major political fundraiser. And at the end of the day, this all boils down to money.
Yeah, absolutely. And lots of talk, too, about how Clooney may possibly have been advised by Obama.
So there are rumors swirling around about who is pulling the strings in this sort of poorly and publicly orchestrated debate about the future of the Biden candidacy. And on the one hand, you have the sort of slight demonization of the First Lady Jill Biden as being the individual who is forcing the issue and supporting her husband's candidacy and telling him under no circumstances should he withdraw. At the same time, there are rumors that President Obama and his political team are seeking to undermine the Biden candidacy. There is no proof of these rumors, and you know, it's been supported strictly by anecdotes that say that there were moments during, of course, their tandem. Joe Biden was Barack Obama's vice president, that during their tandem rule, there was a certain amount of disrespect towards the vice president from the president and his team. You know, this is all sort of palace intrigue for the time being. It's weighty and it's important palace intrigue. And I sense that at one point, when this is finally resolved in one direction or the other, and that will be resolved by the time of the Democratic National Convention, number one, and of course it will be resolved ultimately in the election in November, when this is all over, it's all going to come out. And that will make some of the most fantastic political storytelling ever.
Absolutely. What about Clooney for president then?
Right. Well,
it would be a bit disingenuous, wouldn't it, for him to kind of diss Obama and then Biden and then stand himself.
So that's again part of the political machinery of Washington and the West Coast. We've had our experience with an actor as president before, and it didn't go very well. I suspect that George Clooney probably doesn't really harbor presidential ambitions himself. He's enough of a public figure, as is. If we're going to trade, if we'll indulge ourselves, I guess, for a moment in political rumor mongering, one of the more outlandish ones is that really the woman waiting in the wings in all of this is Michelle Obama, and that if the Democratic National Convention turns, instead of being a coronation of the Biden candidacy, turns into an open sort of auction pit of candidates, that one of them might be the former First Lady. I find that a little bit difficult to believe in the jockeying, the very public jockeying that's already taking place about potential replacement candidates. Her name never comes up.
No, I mean, very, very interesting to watch at any rate. So somewhere else which is having a crisis for the president and indeed for the government as a whole is France.
Right. So we're going to shift gears. We're going to cross the pond. We're going to come to Paris. And an article in the FT, one of the paper's sort of weekend-long reads, which I do recommend very strongly. It's written by one of the FT's sort of superstar writers, and that's Simon Cooper, who's based in Paris and actually tells us in the opening phrase of the article that he is now a French citizen and he voted in most recent elections. And what Simon Cooper does over the course of a very long but very interesting and worthwhile read is he talks about, well, the headline is Paris, the Olympics, and the Reinvention of a City. And what Cooper does here is he doesn't really talk about the Olympics and he doesn't talk about sport. And he doesn't talk about some of the more recent cliches that Paris has been discussed in, which is, the invention of the 15-minute city, which is something that the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, has been talking about for a very, very long time. But what he does is he talks about Paris as an idea, and Paris as a concept, and Paris as an island, an isolated, white, upper-middle-class island in the middle of rural, agricultural, working-class France. Paris used to be surrounded by a medieval wall. It is now surrounded by a highway, the Périphérique, which is physically and symbolically the new fortress that isolates Paris from the rest of its surroundings. And what Cooper does is he delves into an ongoing urban regeneration plan that is really punctuated by the Olympics, and talks about how over the next few years, this wall around Paris will ultimately dissolve, or at least diminish, and Paris will join up with its sort of feared, loathed, and most discussed banlieue, the suburbs. And that the sort of integration of Paris with its broader surroundings will transform both of them. Paris will become less elitist, and the banlieue will sort of rise from their current state.
And of course, this is all Sarkozy's plan from the beginning, which I think is really interesting. Of course, Sarkozy himself and his wife having a particularly torrid time of it this week.
That's right. So, it is interesting that this does trace all the way back to Sarkozy. It traces all the way back to a return flight from a summit in Beijing, where Sarkozy brought one of his advisors along and said, look, on the way to China, I'm going to be really busy planning this summit. On the way back, I'll have a lot less to do, and I want to talk about reforming Paris, and I want you to help me do this. Cooper reflects on what's happened with the recent elections in France and he ties the sort of surging performance, although ultimately unsatisfying from the perspective of Marine Le Pen, the surging but not quite overwhelming performance of the National Rally to a hatred of Paris. And that people who voted for Marine Le Pen are people who were anti-elite, and that Paris has absolutely no National Rally voters in its ranks. And so this was a national attack on its capital. And it's interesting also to even say that Paris is at the center of a region called the Île-de-France, which is, the island of France. And something has to be done here to reduce this notion of Paris as a fortress in the middle of its country.
It's a really, really good piece. I would urge people to have a look at it in the FT. He then goes on to talk about the Olympics, how he's visited the Olympics village. He says Paris doesn't need the Olympics. The suburbs certainly do. He also says most Parisians, he ends by saying, most Parisians just hope the Olympics will pass by without disaster as the parliamentary elections did. Perhaps this Parisian epoch, in hindsight, will resemble Haussmann's era. He, of course, was the man who designed Paris. Almost all the news stories of his day are now forgotten. What survives is the city he created. And I think that perfectly sums up this piece by Simon Cooper. Very, very good piece there in the FT. Now, on to something that we both hate. Isn't it lovely to have a shared bitch? Bikes,
yes.
But specifically bikes that are abandoned in the middle of the street.
That's right. Thank you for raising this up. I couldn't help but notice this as it leapt off the pages of today's Times. And the headline here is Why Britain is Falling Out of Love with Cycling. And so, yes, our shared complaint is about the sort of the proliferation of hire bicycle schemes around London and how they are essentially polluting the city's pavements, or as you might say in America speak, the sidewalks. What the Times is telling us, though, is that since the pandemic, sales of bicycles in the country have absolutely cratered. They fell in 2023 by 5%, which isn't all that much, but that is the continuing of a trend that saw bicycle sales drop by 23% in 2022. Sales just last year were 33% below pre-pandemic levels. And so this is in part a scaling back of what happened during the pandemic. It is a part of an erosion of sales due to the fact that you can hire a bike through an app almost for nothing. And then there are two other factors that the Times discusses, and this is where we get into some of our favorite kind of bellyaches, and that is that cycling is becoming increasingly dangerous, that cyclists themselves have taken on a bit of a kamikaze attitude when it comes to sort of traffic rules. Car versus cycle incidents are on the rise. And, I think people are just sort of losing their nerve when it comes to getting out on the streets in the relative sort of lack of protection of riding on the back of a bicycle.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it looks absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, and I'm one of those people who bought a bicycle during the pandemic and found it quite liberating and loved sort of just treading the streets, well, not treading, but cycling the streets of London in this sort of free way, and enjoying the cycle infrastructure that London has. The other thing that the Times reminds us is that the boom in cycle infrastructure that led to this surge in cycling has stopped. There are no new cycle paths in London, and the amount of new cycling infrastructure that's being built nationwide has ground to a halt. The Times tells us, in comparison with other cities, and the city that the Times holds up here as an example is Ghent in Belgium, which may not be the perfect analog for London, but this is the new cycling nirvana.
Cycling nirvana. I love that concept. Charles, we've got a guest.
How exciting.
I know, right? So shall we take a break so he can come in?
Perfect.
Let's do that.
Monocle's free-to-subscribe daily email newsletters, the Monocle Minute and Weekend Edition, deliver headlines and a swathe of recommendations from our editors, correspondents and bureau. You can also browse a menu of radio highlights and Monocle films. Our weekend newsletters deliver great columns from Andrew Tuck on Saturdays and Tyler Brulé on Sundays, cultural highs, media diets and far-off newspapers, recipes to cook at home. It's a fun take on weekend living. Head to monocle.com/minute to be part of the conversation.
Hello, you're listening to Monocle on Saturday with me, Georgina Godwin. I am joined in the studio by Charles Hecker and now to Neil Griffiths, who's from Weatherglass Books. Good morning to you, Neil.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
It's lovely to have you here. I first became aware of your company because of the wonderful book Ghost Variations by Damien Lanigan, who is, of course, your business partner. And it's just such a wonderful book. And then I sort of looked into who the publisher was and everything. And it's a great, great story. But before the publishing house came a prize. Tell us about your prize.
So it's about 8 years old now. It's got a rather odd name called the Republic of Consciousness Prize for Small Presses, which I founded about 8 years ago, essentially to give a kind of media boost each year to the range of small press books that are coming out. Small press in the UK and the Republic of Ireland, where we cover, are doing a lot of heavy lifting especially in fiction. The big five are doing less experimental, fewer books in translation, etc. And that has been taken up by small presses, but they don't actually have the kind of publicity or marketing budgets. And a prize does that. It gets them into the newspapers, it gets them onto social media, and long lists and short lists and winners create a kind of momentum, which means that bookshops get behind them. And there is a narrative each year about the best books in the small press universe.
And as you say, these are books that we wouldn't ordinarily see because the big publishing houses just won't take the risk.
They won't take the risk anymore. I mean, they used to take the risk. I mean, the economic climate changed, I think, around 2007, 2008, where literary fiction would often be published as a sort of cultural philanthropy, as it were, by the big five, and then big authors like Jamie Oliver would underwrite them. That happens less now. And then, ironically, presses who actually don't have ways of underwriting their difficult literature are somehow finding a way to publish it and keeping the landscape, very vital.
Which is what you do at Weatherglass Press. So tell us now about starting your publishing house.
Well, Damien and I had a conversation over a drink, as one does, and we realised that actually, as great as small presses are, they are kind of breaking in two ways. One way, there is with Fitzcarraldo and Gally Beggar, there is what we might call new modernism, slightly experimental, European, and formally difficult at times. And then there are presses who do works in translation. So you have, Charco do South American, and there's people who do just Balkan translation. But actually we sat there and said, is there a space, or who is going to publish the kind of beautifully crafted novel that is character-led in English? And then we asked ourselves, who would publish The Blue Flower by Penelope Fitzgerald now? An almost perfect novel. And we actually thought, we didn't think even an agent would take it on because they would struggle to sell it. And therefore we wanted to create a space where quietly perfect novels with beautiful writing, beautiful characters and beautiful stories that didn't necessarily shout that loudly about the times or political themes or the zeitgeist would find a home.
And that's exactly what you've done, publishing a raft of wonderful books. And you have another prize planned.
Yes, actually, next week, we're announcing the co-winners of our inaugural novella prize from Weatherglass, nothing to do with the Republic of Consciousness, which is being judged by Ali Smith. We had 200 entries. Damien and I filtered them down to 5, sent them off to Ali, and she came back. She wanted us to publish them all, and we may do, but we have 2 winners. She couldn't separate 2 winners. We're announcing the winners on Wednesday. I have one of them here, which I'm just going to show you, but I'm not going to say anything about it. It's a beautifully designed book. And this is going to be a biannual thing. Ali wants to participate each year. So essentially is choosing to commission for us a number of books, which is wonderful, and we're really grateful that she's got them, and she really enjoyed the process. But Damien feels very strongly about this, is that the novella is the literary form of our time. We need things that, in the way as TV has got longer and has become the equivalent of the 19th century novel, the way we read, and this is often talked about, has got, we want shorter, sharper expressions in literature. And the novella, and if you go back over the last 100 years, Great Gatsby, etc., Old Man and the Sea, a lot of novellas have been hugely important and have, really punched above their weight in terms of the great books of the last, 100 years.
Well, speaking of the great books of the last 100 years, I wonder if you've been following the New York Times countdown. They have the 100 best books of the 21st century. And this week they finally published the last 20, from 20 down to 1. Charles, tell us about this piece.
Oh, that's right. We've discussed this in previous appearances, because the New York Times for the past several weeks has been revealing the results of a survey that's both sort of data-driven and sort of writer and literary world input-driven, naming in the upcoming, since it'll soon be 25 years of the first of the 21st century, the first 100 years, they've named their 100 best books. And so they have finally brought us to the top 20.
Can I just tell you that at 99, it's Ali Smith.
Right.
With How to Be Both.
Okay. Oh, really? Is that her only entry?
I don't know. I've only got that far in my scrolling.
On that topic, scrolling through the top 100 list is an absolute joy, because you can look at the books that you've read and remember them fondly, and then you can think about the books that you wanted to read or perhaps have sitting on your bookshelf and haven't quite cracked yet, and then there are the books that you've always wanted to read but haven't bought yet, and just going through that list is really stimulating. Shall we, without too much drum roll, shall we reveal who the number one is?
Well, can I just say that the number 10 is my number 1.
Okay, let me get to number 10.
Okay,
Wait. I'm 80, 70, 60. There are so many extraordinary books on here. And so many, as you say, Charles, you look at them and you think, I know that title, I know the cover, I know the author. I just have never got around to reading the book.
I will, when I get home. I haven't seen I've seen the top 10. I will go home and I will tick everyone I have read, want to read, have never heard of. And in the top 10, there are two books I've never heard of, which is a bit of a shock to me.
Yeah, so many people. Andrew Solomon here with Far From the Tree. We've got Viet Thanh Nguyen, all people who've been on Meet the Writers. So a lot of these books, we've had those authors in the studio speaking to us about their works, which is a wonderful thing. So you can hear, from the authors themselves if you tune into the programme. And I do hope, while we're talking about that, that at some point, Neil, you're going to come and talk to us about your books, because you've published 3.
I have published 3, yes. Interestingly, I was published by Penguin for my first 2, and had, how should we say, a very traumatic experience. And then I went to probably the smallest publisher around. They hadn't even published a book when they commissioned my, I have to say, 600-page theological novel, which once again, that's kind of an example, indicative of what small presses are willing to do. They're willing to take on big books that don't have a huge commercial potential because an editor happens to fall in love with it and isn't doing the calculus, as it were, on terms of size of book, depth of feeling, price, readership. Because if you do that, you wouldn't publish anything.
Yeah, no, that's true. Right, so I now know who your favourite author is, Marilyn Robinson.
Yeah, favourite 21st century author, and I mean a book that I will read again and again and again, and I can understand why it's not number one, but Gilead. I mean, in fact, Gilead and Home, which is the book afterwards, I still think are the great books of the 21st century.
Now, what I'm finding really shocking is that number 2 I have not heard of.
Yeah.
Hold on, scrolling quickly down.
Number 2 is The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. It was published in 2010, and it says here it's a stirring, meticulously researched and myth-dispelling book which details the great migration of black Americans from south to north and west from 1915 to 1970.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, Isabel Wilkerson at some point, or even perhaps to this day, is or was a reporter for the New York Times. I don't want to make a mistake like that in the broadcast, but her name is enormously familiar to me, and I have heard of the book. This is one of the ones where, the Times in this long list is highly interactive, and if you've read it, you can tick a box and contribute your feedback. And if you want to read it, you can tick an alternate box, and it sort of makes a little list for you and helps you buy all of these books. And
not that this is a cynical marketing exercise in any way, or promoting New York Times writers.
Not in the slightest, although, if we're marketing books and marketing writers, well, then we'll give them a little bit of a break about that, although they may not be marketing us. But in any case, you're right. Out of the top 10, I recognize all except for one. I've read one of them. I couldn't disagree more with their ranking, and perhaps I'll sort of leave the name out. Not my favorite writer and not his best book. But, I think the top 10 is, just because I do recognize most of them, are all extremely well-deserved. Who wants to break the news about number 1?
Not even written in English originally.
No. Oh, and that's one of the things. There are various conditions about getting onto the list in the first place. And that is that the book has to have been published in the U.S. And that doesn't mean it's a U.S. author or a U.S. publisher, but it has to have at least touched U.S. soil. And it can be in translation. So they're perfectly happy. And as you see here by the winner, they're perfectly happy for international books to be on this list. And, the enormous panel of sort of book world people who helped compose this list are from all over the world.
And what I love about this particular winner is that we don't even know what her real name is, or if she's a she, or perhaps they, maybe there are more than one of them.
And I've never read it.
No, I haven't either. What is it?
That makes three of us.
Why? But
Yeah.
I just wonder what it is that makes none of us want to read Elena Ferrante.
Okay, well, you've spilled the beans, and number 1 is Elena Ferrante, my brilliant friend. I think this is the first one. Is it? Yes, this is the first volume in a 4-book series of novels written under a pseudonym. And the books are global bestsellers and have been translated into just about every language imaginable. I've not gone near it.
I read one of her books, which I thought was okay. Which obviously, but then you think, well, do I want to move on to another one? And do I want to start a 4-book series? Also, my first 2 novels are set in Naples, so I have a particular relationship to Naples, but Naples as an outsider, and then you don't really want necessarily. You feel slightly odd about a real Neapolitan writer reflecting something back to you, and I don't know, maybe there's some envy there or something. But I've stayed away, and it's partly sometimes. Successful authors, there is not only professional envy. You want to move on to the outliers in literature because they're going to be sustained by the book clubs and those larger readerships that want to to be reading part of that kind of wider conversation.
I mean, I guess for me, one of the reasons I have not read her or them or him, whoever they are, is that I have to read to order. In other words, I've got to read the next person I'm interviewing, either for the programme or for a literary festival. And of course, they are not going to appear. I'm not going to be allowed to interview this person because we are not allowed to know who this person is. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons I haven't read it. But you know what? This is my fallow period. I haven't got a literary festival for at least a month now. So I think that actually maybe that will be my ambition for this month.
Well, Neil mentioned something really interesting about making a commitment to reading a 4-book series, and with your mention of the novella as the new literary form, or the most popular emerging literary form, is there something about attention span or the amount of time that we can dedicate to reading that keeps us away from this commitment to a 4-book series, which is a different kind of commitment than to sort of binging 4 episodes of television? Well,
yeah, absolutely. And I also wonder whether one can think about whether it's going to be sustainedly a good read. So there's the big book that comes out, and then other books come out, and you kind of go, well, will they be as good? And therefore, I think it's there's a certain amount of jeopardy. I think because if you commit to it and love it, then that's fine. But if you don't, do you carry on? I'm not sure. Let's leave sequels to films.
Yes. That's it. I'm afraid we're out of time. But Neil, many thanks for coming in. Neil Griffiths from Weatherglass Press. And do have a look at the press and the wonderful books that it publishes. And stay tuned for the announcement about the Novella Prize, judged by Ali Smith. Also thanks to Charles Hecker. Of course, his book about to come out called Zero Sum. It's all about business in Russia. Many thanks too to Mariella Bevan, who's been behind the glass there. And that's it for Monocle on Saturday, which will return at the same time next weekend. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.